Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to this ProCopywriters webinar. I'm Leif Kendall. I'm the Director of ProCopywriters. I'm also a freelance copywriter. We're delighted to be joined today by Richard Shotton. He's the author of a fascinating book called The Choice Factory, which I reckon every copywriter should read if you haven't already. And Richard's presentation is about one of the cognitive biases that influences the way we make decisions. So over to you, Richard.
Hi, I'm going to be talking about one particular bias that I think is particularly relevant to advertisers. And when I say bias, what I mean is essentially an insight into human nature that's been identified by social psychologists or behavioural scientists. And the bias in particular that I want to discuss is one called the pratfall effect. So it's the idea that people or brands become more appealing if they admit a weakness. Now, I want to start with perhaps my favourite example of this, and it goes back to 1984. And 1984, Ian Banks had just turned 30, and he had been writing full-length novels for the last 16 years. He'd written his first, albeit unpublished, first full-length novel at 14, and then over the next 15, 16 years, he'd written another 3 novels. But unfortunately, none of these novels had piqued the interest of any publishers. They all remained unpublished. And at that stage, he was so desperate to capture the interest of the publishers that he decided to switch genre. So he moved away from his favoured genre of science fiction and began to write more realistic fare. And the book that he then wrote at the age of 30 was called The Wasp Factory, and it was The Wasp Factory that was first picked up by a publisher, and a publisher called Macmillan, who decided to gamble on it and publish it. So they began by sending out review copies of the book and got broadly positive feedback. The New York Times, and probably one of the best reviews, said it was brilliant. The FT said it was impossible to put down. But alongside these positive reviews, Banks got some quite scathing reviews. And when I say scathing, I'm not exaggerating. I'll read you the Sunday Express review. A silly, gloatingly sadistic and grisly yarn of a family of Scots lunatics, one of whom tortures small creatures. A bit better written than most horror hokum, but really just the literary equivalent of a video nasty. The Times were a bit more succinct. They said it was rubbish. Now, it was at this stage that Banks broke with tradition, and he said to the publisher, he said to Macmillan, that he wanted all the reviews, good and bad, to run on the back cover. The Macmillan were aghast. Why would anyone buy a book if even the author couldn't find half a dozen decent reviews? But Banks was adamant, and his wish happened. His cover, the first edition of the Wasp Factory, included both the positive reviews and the awful ones. And it seems like Banks's chutzpah paid off. This was the book that launched his 30-year career as one of the kind of premier writers of his generation. And certainly Banks claimed that his decision to run the negative reviews was part of that. He said in one of his final interviews before he died that people still came up to him on the streets of Edinburgh and said that they had first had their interest piqued by his bravery at running these reviews. But of course, that is just one anecdote. Is it really the case? Was Banks right? Is it really the case that if you admit a weakness, you can become more appealing? And the evidence from social psychology would suggest that Banks was onto something. And that evidence comes from this man, you can see on your screen now, Elliot Aronson. And Elliot Aronson was the professor of psychology at Harvard University in the 1960s. And in 1966, he ran what was probably his most famous experiment. He ran this with two other psychologists called Floyd and Willerman. And the setup was quite simple. He recruited a colleague to take part in a quiz, and he then recorded that contestant. Now, before the contestant started, Banks had given him the answers to the quiz. So he did remarkably well. He got 92% of the questions right. He looks like a genius. He wins the quiz by miles. But then as the quiz is coming to an end, the contestant makes what's called a pratfall. That's an Americanism for a small blunder. He stands up and spills a cup of coffee down himself. Aronson then takes that recording. He's been recording this quiz that's been going on. He takes that recording and he plays it to people. And he plays it in one of two versions. He either plays out the entire incident, brilliant performance and pratfall, or just the brilliant performance. He then asked those participants in his experiment, what do you think of this man? How appealing do you think this contestant is? And on all these metrics of appeal, the contestant is seen as significantly more appealing if people have heard the mistake as well as the great performance. So Aronson, after doing a number of experiments around this theme, calls it the pratfall effect. So it's the idea that if you admit a weakness, you become more appealing. Now, it seems like this finding is not just relevant to people. A colleague and I, Jenny Riddell, reran an unpublished study done by Adam Ferrier. So we found 626 nationally representative shoppers, and we showed them two pictures of cookies. We said to them, look, make a snap decision. Which of these cookies would you prefer to eat? And 66% of people plump for the one on the left. Now, if you look at the cookies closely, they are almost identical. The one on the left is the original cookie with its rough flawed edge. The one on the right has been tweaked by a graphic designer, so it just has a perfectly flawless a circular shape. So again, an example here in a very particular category where having a flaw makes a product more appealing. And yes, of course, in cookies, in food, there's probably particular connotations about flaws, that it's authentic, that it's handmade, that it's small batch. But interestingly, other work done in 2015 suggests this finding that perfection is too good to be true occurs in far more categories than just food. So the data I'm now putting up is from a 2015 study by Northwestern University. And what Northwestern University did was look at 111,460 products and reviews of those products. And then they looked at the likelihood of people reading a review and then going on to purchase. So if you look at the diagram in front of you, Northwestern did this across 22 product categories, and they all showed the same pattern, but the one I've got in front of you is salon hair care. So what you can see happening is, as the review gets better, as a standard economics would predict, people become more likely to purchase. But then at some point between 4.2 and 4.5, depending on the category, so I think hair care was 4.2, light bulbs were 4.5, at some point the likely to purchase peaks, and if the reviews get any better, then likelihood to purchase declines. So the academics argued this was caused by consumers thinking that perfection is too good to be true. They didn't trust perfection. Now, what's interesting about this, we've got academic evidence here, real world evidence, this large scale analysis by Northwestern, is how many of the greatest ever ad campaigns have harnessed this bias. So think back to 1959, what Ad Age called the most creative campaign of the 20th century. Of course, you've got VW Beetle. Admitting a flaw was at the heart of that campaign. Ugly is only skin deep. admitting the car was ugly. They admitted it was small. There's a less well-known ad here admitting it was slow. I don't know if you can spot in the bottom left-hand corner, but there's a particularly wonderful line from Bob Leveson, which goes along the lines of, you can tell them from Volkswagens because the VW won't go over 72 miles an hour, even though the speedometer shows a wildly optimistic top speed of 90. Now, again, the same agency 3 years later did the same trick with Avis. Did the same trick with Avis, admitting that the cars were unpopular. Phenomenally successful line from Paula Green that ran for 50 years. Again, Listerine admitted they tasted awful, the taste you hate twice a day. Stella, 1981 campaign, ran for 26 years from Lowe, admitting they were expensive, reassuringly expensive. Coming more up to date, you've even got some recent ads. I think this one was from 2017 for the Snowbird ski resort. They got a poor review from Greg in Los Angeles, who criticized the run for being so steep and so dangerous. They ran that and used it as a way to appeal to the more sophisticated skier. You've even got from Holland, and this probably takes the pratfall effect to ridiculous extremes, you've even got the Hansbrinker hotel examples. So admitting quite how poor service they offer. Now, if you think of these campaigns that I've shown you, I think they're powerful for three big reasons. There's three reasons why admitting a weakness is a remarkably successful approach. And the first is that consumers assume that advertisers are partial with the truth. And that's at best. At worst, they assume advertisers lie. So the fantastic thing of admitting a weakness is that you've given people a tangible demonstration of your honesty, and then all your other claims become that much more believable. The second big strength is that consumers aren't naive. They've got a lot of experience. They know that most products, there will be a trade-off. Nothing is perfect. And therefore, if as a brand, you do not highlight your flaw, if you don't admit a flaw, what happens is not that a consumer thinks you're perfect. It's that a consumer still knows there's a flaw in your product. They just don't know where it is, and you leave it up to them to imagine where that flaw lies. And the danger of doing that is that they may think the flaw lies somewhere consequential. So Rory Sutherland, brilliant Ogilvy guy who's fascinated by behavioural science, he has put a wonderful argument about this admission of a flaw being crucial to the success of budget airlines. Because if you think back to, what was it, the mid-1990s when budget airlines launched, these were bizarre things. One day you're being told you can fly to Berlin for 200 quid, the next day you're being told you can do it for a fiver. Now, Rory Sutherland argues that if the budget airlines hadn't gone out and told people their service was shoddy, people might have assumed the flaw lay in safety. They might have assumed that those great prices were delivered by people taking shortcuts around safety, that poorly trained pilots or third-hand Aeroflot jets. And therefore they'd have never stepped foot on one of those EasyJet or Ryanair planes. But instead, what they did was be very open about their shoddy service, and therefore people could understand where the trade-off was, and therefore they could understand the trade-off, and therefore they were happy to accept the deal. And then the third and final big strength, I think if you think back to some of the advertising examples that I've shown, what those great advertisers did was not pick a weakness randomly. They chose a weakness that had a mirror strength. Let's think about VW. They went out and said they were ugly, they were slow. But the flip side of that was, well, we don't care about aesthetic fripperies. We're interested in engineering excellence. It made their underlying message that much more believable. Or Listerine, they admit, well, yes, we taste awful, but what would you expect from a potent medicine? Even Hans Brinker, I think there's an element here of, yes, we're a dive, but by God, you're going to have a good time. Now, considering I think there is such strong evidence for this tactic, remember we've got academic evidence, we've got anecdotes, we've got case study, we've got real world evidence, we've got that huge analysis from Northwestern. There's a phenomenal amount of evidence that admitting a weakness is a powerful tactic. Yet, it's a remarkably rare approach from brands. Now, I've listed, half a dozen brands that have used this tactic, and I'm sure if we thought about it further, we could get probably maybe a dozen or 2 dozen. But those brands stretch back to 1959. In the intervening period, there have been tens of thousands of adverts, and a vanishingly small number have used the pratfall effect. That's not just supposition. I took a random weekend's worth of papers, went through all the papers, looked at about 600 odd ads, and if I was being very loose in my term, the pratfall effect, very loose in the definition, there may have been a couple of ads that use the pratfall effect. If I was being tight on the definition, there wasn't a single one. So I think this leaves a bit of a conundrum. Why is it that such a well-proven tactic is used by far less than 1% of brands? And the answer, I think, lies in the work of this man. So this is Stephen Ross, and Stephen Ross is the professor of, or was the professor of finance at MIT. And he coined the term the principal agent problem. And I think it's the principal agent problem that stops the pratfall effect being run regularly. And what he meant by that was the principal essentially is the business or the shareholder, and the agent is the employee or the marketer. And Ross argued that there was a divergence of interest between those two parties. So what's in the interest of the principal is not necessarily in the interest of the agent. So the principal, the employee or shareholder, they want long-term, sustainable, profitable growth. Now the agent, the marketer, of course they want that, but more importantly, they also want safe career progression. And one thing that the pratfall does is it may well deliver, this brilliant evidence for it delivering long-term sustainable growth, but what it doesn't necessarily do is deliver you safe career progression. Imagine back to 1981 and you're the marketing director who's come up with the idea of reassuring expensive. Now, 6 months into the campaign, in our alternate universe, let's say that campaign bombs. And however good the campaign is, there's always a chance it will bomb because not all factors are under your control. Now, if the campaign had bombed and you had to go and explain that you'd spent millions of pounds on this campaign and had to go and explain that to your CEO, I think you'd be lucky to escape with your job, because the CEO, in all likelihood, if it's a random company, is not going to be conversant with behavioural economics. He's going to believe probably more in classical economics. So he'll be thinking, well, of course this campaign bombed. You told people it was expensive, just as we expect from price, that will therefore dampen demand. So you'd probably be fired. But again, paradoxically, this potential weakness of the brand makes it all the stronger, because of the selfish motives of marketers and employees, and potentially agencies, it will mean that it is always a minority tactic. And if there's one thing we know in advertising, it's that what is distinctive is memorable. As John Haggerty put it, or Barbara Noakes put it so memorably, when the world zigs, zag. Now that isn't just anecdote. There is work stretching back to 1933 that shows that what is distinctive is highly memorable. and it's known among psychologists as the von Restorff effect. So von Restorff, or Hedwig von Restorff, one of the best ever named psychologists, was a pediatrician in the 1930s at the University of Berlin. And in 1933, she does her fantastic experiment which unearths this bias, that distinctiveness is memorable. So what she did, she recruited a group of people to take part. They all do it individually, and she gave them random 3-digit strings of letters. So to begin with, they might see JRM, TWS, JWS, ALP, RSB, and then occasionally they'd be interspersed with number. So for example, 153. After people seeing these long strings of text, she would then remove the text and ask people to recall some of those strings of digits. And people invariably remembered the ones that stood out. So if they'd seen a long list of letters, they remembered the numbers. If they'd seen a long list of mainly numbers, they remembered the letters. Now, you may be thinking, well, and you might think this about the pratfall effect. This is von Restorff effect was discovered in 1933. The pratfall effect was discovered in 1966. Is this still relevant? Now we've got the internet. Now we've got millennials. Are these insights still valid? And I think the best word on that is probably from Bill Bernbach, who wonderfully said, look, it takes millions of years for human nature to develop. It will take millions more for it to even vary. It may be fashionable to talk about the changing man, but as communicators, we should be concerned with the unchanging man. Now, all these biases, and these are just two, but there are plenty more, a lot of them have an evolutionary basis. So they are not changing rapidly. Whatever societal changes there are in the last few years, the underlying reason for that bias remains, and they still have their power. But rather than taking my word, or more importantly Bernbach's word on that, a colleague, Laura Weston, and I decided in 2017 to rerun von Restorff's experiment. So we did a very similar approach to hers. We gave people a list of 15 numbers, 14 blue, written in blue, 1 written in black. Removed those numbers, and a while later asked them to remember the numbers. And people were 30 times more likely to remember the number that had been written in a colour that stood out. We again did the same with logos, mixing up, say, 15 car logos with one fast food brand, or 15 fast food brands and 1 car logo. And again, people invariably remembered the one that stood out. So not only does the pratfall effect have a huge strength in and of itself, the fact that it suffers from the principal agent problem will always mean it's distinctive, and therefore it will always be phenomenally powerful. Now, I guess that means, is the pratfall effect relevant for every single brand? Regardless of whether marketers choose to use it, is it relevant and is it powerful for every single brand? And it is worth, at this stage, kind of final part of the talk, noting some of the nuances of the bias. Because I think with every psychological bias, there is a headline finding, but then when you dig into the extra papers that have been written about the subject, there's normally some nuances. And there's a couple of nuances on the pratfall effect, which may make it relevant for some products more than others. So the first nuance is Aronson himself reran the experiment with a slight twist a few years later, and he this time got the contestant to do poorly. The contestant only answered 30% of the ads correctly. So he takes that recording. Remember, this was, he'd recorded the contestant at a quiz, answers the questions, then stands up, spills a cup of coffee down himself. So again, he takes that whole recording, sometimes playing the entirety to people, sometimes just the quiz performance. What he now finds is when the contestant performed poorly at the quiz, if people also heard a mistake, they liked him, they liked the contestant even less. He was less appealing. So when the contestant does it very well at the quiz and makes a mistake, he's very appealing. When he does poorly at the quiz and makes a mistake, he's unappealing. So it seems like the pratfall effect has a multiplicative effect, that if you have a strength, admitting a weakness makes you look stronger. If you're weak, if you have a poor perception of brand and you admit more mistakes, then actually you're liked less. So I think there needs to be an honest appraisal of the brand strengths. Do you have credibility in the market for you to harness the pratfall effect? The second thing to consider for your particular brand is, what type of category you work in. Is it one where the competitors slavishly follow category convention? You know, the more they follow convention, the more similar they are. I think sorry, when I say category convention, if the category convention is about showing off, if it's about bragging, the more they do that, the more valuable the pratfall effect would be. You know, so I'm thinking here something like perfumes, for example, or beauty products, where there's very rarely admission of weakness. Cars, booze, often these areas, I think there's a particular strength, the pratfall effect. But my favourite is an old one, which you might be less familiar with. And here it's probably in the category that brags the most. It's amongst estate agents. And the example is a guy called Rory Brooks, who in the 1960s became famous for his the ads that he wrote. So he just wrote tiny little fractional ads in the property pages of newspapers, but they became they became famous. You know, he appeared in Sunday Time editorials. He appeared on the big chat shows of the day. And I'll read one of them out because this one I couldn't find an image online. Like I didn't find the text. So here's a typical ad. Sorry, his whole thing was that he was brutally honest about some of these properties. So here's a typical ad from the 1960s. Wanted, someone with taste, means, and a strong stomach enough to buy this erstwhile house of ill repute in Pimlico. It is untouched by the 20th century as far as conveniences for even the basic human decencies are concerned. Although it reeks of damp or worse, the plaster is coming off the walls and daylight peeps through a hole in the roof. It's still habitable, judging by the bed of rags, fag ends and empty bottles in one corner. Plenty of scope for the socially aspiring to express their decorative taste and get their abode in the glossy, and nothing to stop them putting Westminster on their notepaper. Comprises 10 rather unpleasant rooms with slimy backyard. 4,650 freehold. Tarted up, these houses make 15,000. So Brooks was completely open about some of the weaknesses. He wasn't trying to pretend that this house in particular wasn't in a bad state, but also it wasn't just a long list of negatives. What he got in there was the key postcode fact. This was in Westminster, a highly sought after area, and also the fact that it was a developer's opportunity. You know, tart it up, you're going to make nearly 11 grand. The ads became famous in themselves, and Rory Brooks' estate agent grew hugely, all from this use of the pratfall effect. And as I say, I think it was particularly powerful amongst estate agents because everyone else was zigging and he zagged. The final example or nuance to the pratfall effect is around gender. And you want to be a little bit careful about this one. I've only ever seen one study done on this, and I think with psychology, it's always more believable, more powerful if there are multiple studies finding the same thing. But there's one study done in the 1970s by Kay Doe, and she looked at rerunning the pratfall effect, and the key thing she did was split the results by men and women. And what she found is that men were far more influenced by the pratfall effect than women. And her argument was that maybe this is about men seeing other men as less competitive, less competition, less aggressive, if they exhibit the pratfall effect. So there could be something there. If you're targeting, if your brand is heavily skewed to men, it might be that the pratfall effect is particularly relevant. So of all the biases that have been discovered by behavioural scientists, I think the most relevant is the pratfall effect because one, there's so much evidence for it, real world evidence, lab evidence, advertising case study, and yet despite that, it is barely used, which means that its distinctiveness will always make it even that much more stronger. But beyond those business reasons for loving this bias, I must admit I do have some kind of personal affection for it, in that I'm a bit of a klutz, and I think this webinar's been going for 35 odd minutes, and I've managed not to knock the laptop on the floor or spill my cup of coffee down myself, which is a bit of a miracle. So I always love talking to people about the pratfall effect, because I think if you make a mistake during the presentation, if the slides go black or something falls over, you can pretend that it was all done on purpose, and it's just a clever way of harnessing the pratfall effect to make yourself more appealing. So there are extra benefits to it. And the final reason I love the pratfall effect is, as was mentioned at the beginning, I've just written a book called The Choice Factory, and it's all about the behavioural biases that influence what we buy. And unfortunately, the book has been a walking example of the pratfall effect, in that everything that could have gone wrong has gone wrong. So the publisher got the wrong price on the books, had to go back to the printers and get reprinted. The publisher didn't order enough copies of the books that sold out on Amazon the first day, and therefore no one could buy the bloody thing. And even stuff that I thought was going to go really well has had a sting in the tail. And one of those things that started off going very well was getting reviews. So because I didn't have any budget to support this book, I thought the best way to promote it was send copies to people I admire, get them to write a little review, I'll send that to magazines, and then I'll get a bit of publicity. So I sent it to people like Dave Trott, Drayton Bird, Rory Sutherland, Steve Harrison, and got some lovely reviews, and I sent them off to magazines. Now, one of those reviews that I sent off was this one. So it's a quote from Mark Ritson, who, if you know Mark Ritson, is quite he says what he thinks. So he started off by slagging off other writers in marketing, saying that they were a cacophony of overstatement, and then in contrast, I possessed a balanced voice. So I thought that was very nice, send that off to lots of places. And then a couple of days later, I went and had a look at those sites to see if they'd run anything. And on one site called M&AD, which essentially is the New Zealand version of Campaign, they had run this, a cacophony of overstatement. So I emailed the editor and said, look, I don't think this is a fair reflection of what the review said. It's not a fair reflection of the spirit of the view. And he wrote back and said, oh, no, we thought this sounded excellent. So I think there's a worrying judgment there on the kind of state of modern journalism, and that no one knows what a cacophony means. So I was ranting about this to my wife, saying how unfair the world was. And my wife, who is a copywriter and far cannier than I, said, well, look, there's no point getting angry. Why don't you just play people at their own game? And so she went and looked at some of the other reviews I got, and one that caught her eye in particular was this one. I'd emailed Martin Sorrell and said, look, can you read this book? And he'd come back and said, we'll take a look. He replied remarkably quickly, actually, it's quite suspiciously quickly. But anyway, so he replied and said, we'll take a look. And my wife said, well, why don't we edit that and stick this on the front cover? Martin Sorrell says, take a look. Now, if I had any bravery at all, I would have run that on the front cover. But being a coward and not wanting to annoy the most powerful man in media, I ran a Rory Sutherland one instead. But I hope that was useful. I think we've got time for questions. So if any of you have agree with what I've been saying, and I think there are other examples we could draw on, please say. If you disagree, that's fine. Just email away. Or if there are any other questions or points of clarification, I'd love to hear about them. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. That was fantastic. And I think, that example with that review was really quite shocking, the cacophony. I mean, who would think that's a good thing? I mean, a cacophony of overstatement. That's really just, it doesn't get much worse than that.
No. I mean, the bizarre thing is, I went into the book tour in Denmark, and I mentioned this, this kind of cock up in Denmark. Yes, these are people where English is their second language, and they understood that that was an awful word. So how some guy in New Zealand didn't, I don't quite know. I mean, yeah, worrying.
Bizarre, unless he was being very, very clever and was trying to engage the pratfall effect on your behalf.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But so yeah, very interesting. But then it would have fallen victim of that. I think that requirement to have some credibility first. And unfortunately, I don't think anyone knows me in New Zealand. So
yes,
yeah,
you have no credibility. I'd forgotten.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So we haven't had any questions through from anybody else, but there was one thing that I kept thinking about during your presentation, and that was that most of the clients I work with, there are lots of SMEs, I suppose, fairly small companies, and often in like B2B. So not kind of big, brave brands. They tend to be quite conservative. But what they all suffer from is it's like their approach to branding is to look at it almost like camouflage. How can we dress ourselves up to look like everybody else so that we don't cause any offense, like we don't get any attention? And it's kind of the opposite of the stuff you were saying about if everyone's going to zig, then zag. All of my clients are like, oh, hey, they're zigging. Let's zig too. That is their approach to everything. And how on earth do you persuade? And I imagine for a lot of copywriters that aren't working on like big kind of global ad campaigns, it's probably the similar experience that people want to stay safe, and they want on the one hand to get attention, but they don't want to ruffle feathers. So I mean, how do you persuade people to try something different and stand out?
Okay. I think there are a number of things. I think firstly, I think bravery is a interesting word. I would argue from the brand's perspective that there is nothing brave about doing the pratfall effect. All the evidence suggests this is a highly effective approach. The interesting thing comes in the risk to the individual, and the risk to the individual is if the organisation or the powers that be do not believe in behavioural science. So I would say if you're in an organisation, rather than just persuading the marketer, his boss needs to believe in behavioural science as well. If the CEO is suspicious, then I think you've got a bit of a problem. So it might be that there are certain, so I think that's one area, that if you can persuade people about the power of behavioural science, then suddenly it becomes lower risk, not more risk. It might also be there are certain types of brand where the risks of the employee is less. So that would be things like, I think, companies owned by venture capitalists or family-owned companies, where there's less of a divergence between just the principal and the agent. It might also work particularly well for challenger brands, where they see this as a if you're working with a brand who's fifth or sixth in the market, then there's a greater upside. I also think there's the kind of a third approach of sometimes people believe that yes, consumers are affected by these biases, but they are business division or professional decision makers are not. But there is lots of evidence that the biases are affect professional decision makers as well. So one of the most famous biases is one called anchoring, and it's the idea that if you throw out a number at the beginning of someone's deliberations, they cannot but help be affected by it. So negotiating a pay rise, or if you or how much a contract's going to be worth, the thing to do is to get that your estimate out first. That sets an anchor, and it kind of defines where everyone goes after that. Now that's not just speculation on my part. There was a experiment done by, I think it was Neil and Northcraft, amongst real estate agents, and what they did was they took people to a house and they gave them a pack of all the information, and they asked them to value that house. And then sometimes in that pack of information they had a a high price that the couple wanted to list it for, say $500,000, sometimes a low price, $300,000. And what they found was, even though the interests of the couple shouldn't have an effect on the value of the house, estate agents were significantly influenced by it. They came back and said the house was worth more if they saw a large listing price. So even professionals are affected by this. And then the final point, how I've, in my role, how I've tried to persuade people of the validity of behavioural science is normally a threefold process. Firstly, I take them through the academic evidence. In this case, that'd be Aronson. Then I show them a quick, rough and ready or fast and frugal experiment I've done for their particular brand, like that cookie example. And then the third thing I say to them is, look, don't just take this on the experiment and the academic evidence alone. Now go out and run a real world test. And then I think if you go through that threefold process, it gets around most people's worries.
Okay, fantastic. And we've actually had a couple of other questions come in. So I think we'll have time just to get to those before the session ends. So the first one was from David Ritson, who says, thanks for a great presentation. It seems like a very Reginald Perrin form of marketing. So he's a big fan. If you're not familiar with Reginald Perrin, I suggest you go and watch the series. I think it's from the 70s, but it's fantastic. But anyway, David asks, he thinks that this approach seems like a very British form of marketing, and he wonders how it would go down with an American audience.
I mean, that is I think that's a fascinating question. That's a great question. And do you know what? If before I'd started looking into that, I would have strongly agreed. I thought, well, isn't this part of our national character? But if you think back through the evidence I've shown you, the Northwestern University, that study of product reviews was global. Aronson did this originally amongst Americans. So his study was in Americans. Kay Doe's study was in Americans. The ads that I showed you, majority were probably Americans. What we had, Avis, Beetle, we had Snowbird, and then of course you've got there's the Dutch Hans Brink Hotel. So it seems to have an effect as at least as strong in America as it does here. And actually, I think the interesting thing is going back to why are these behavioural biases there? And there's often an evolutionary reason. So yes, there are cultural differences, and it's certainly worth, as I mentioned, that threefold test of testing them in your particular market for your particular brand. But often the underlying reason for many behavioural biases is a shared one across the world. So I think they are more universal than people think.
Okay, fantastic. And then Ashley asks if the pratfall effect is similar to the current wave of authenticity that a lot of brands and social media influencers are using at the moment.
Okay, great question. I would say not, because I don't know. It depends. That's quite a broad question. So he could have very different examples in his mind. But often, I think when brands say they're being authentic, they often don't show all their flaws. They instead pretend that, it's often a pretense that they are ethical and moral. So it's almost a fake authenticity that they're projecting. It just happens to be done by through different means, through influencers. So unless those brands are admitting a flaw, I don't think they're tapping into the pratfall effect. If they're going out and saying we're authentic, we care about everyone, we engage in ethical practices, that is just another claim to being perfect, just a different angle on being perfect. So unless Alice is thinking of it in a different way, I don't think that's an example of the pratfall effect.
Yeah.
Sorry, Ashley.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah.
Cool. And I suppose, sometimes that authenticity is, very, very slick and immaculately presented, and suspiciously not very rough around the edges. So,
Yeah.
Okay, and then
Yeah. I guess if you think about it, I mean, it does. It definitely depends on what examples he's thinking of. I think I read something recently which was Domino's had started photoing their pizzas in a kind of slightly less polished manner. So if he means that, absolutely, that's the pratfall effect. If he means claims to being angelic, then no.
okay, fantastic. And let's see, we've just had another question from Richard Steele. He says, thanks, Richard. That was really interesting. I've recently gone freelance as a copywriter and I'm building my personal brand. One of the things I'm finding challenging is balancing self-promotion and demonstrating that he knows what he's doing with vulnerability and authenticity on social media. And any advice on not sounding like a robot or an idiot?
Yes. So I've completely forgotten about this example. There is a brilliant advertising CV example of the pratfall effect. I can't remember the guy's name. I'm pretty sure he ended up getting a job at Ogilvy or had worked at Ogilvy. So I can email the details. But essentially what he did was he did his mini experiment. He had his standard CV, his portfolio, all the awards he'd won. And then he wrote another CV in which he admitted all the things that had gone wrong, admitted all his weaknesses, and then he sent them out to companies and looked at the different response rates. Now, this was far from a scientific study. I don't know, he may have contacted 50 agencies, but he got far more responses when he admitted all his mistakes. Partly because he would have massively stood out, and partly it gave him an opportunity to showcase his creativity. He didn't just write that he had cocked up on something; he did it in a very funny, witty way. So there is there is an actual example, and I will try and dig out the details if you're interested, around people using weaknesses in their kind of portfolio to appeal. So if you do that on social media, you'll stand out tenfold.
And I guess with that, looking at the way you present yourself online as an individual, or the way you put your CV together, sometimes there is value in just being different, because people are getting so many CVs, so many people have been to the same universities, they've done the same courses, they've done the same work experience. How do you choose between those people? Where if somebody comes along and gets your attention, they're going to stand out. That's the one you remember.
Yes. But it's also I love that there's a Stephen King, Jeremy Bullmore article, and it's about, look, too many brands think that advertising works on an input model. I tell you something, and that is just inputted into the consumer's mind. What King and Bullmore argued is that advertising works on an output model. It doesn't matter what you say; it's what's taken out from that message that matters. So I think Jeremy Bullmore's particular example is, look, if I go out and say I'm a wonderfully humble man, what you take out from that is not that he is humble. You take out he's an arrogant sort. So it can be completely opposite of what's said. It's an output model. So going out and saying things have gone wrong does not lead you to looking weak. There's a whole batch of related psychological experiments called the red sneaker effect, and what they argue, that which is, I think Francesco Gina does this, argues that it is only people who have social capital, who have respect, who could admit weaknesses, because they can afford to do that. So I think if you go out and admit flaws on social media or in your CV or in your portfolio, what the employee or the listener takes out from that is not that you are substandard and weak, it's that you are very confident in your abilities. I think you think back to the VW example. People must have felt, good God, if this brand can say these things and still expect to sell out, how good must they be? So I think it's a very powerful tactic.
Yeah, and perhaps when it comes to your own work, and talking about Richard Steele, who asked the question, I mean, perhaps it's partly about thinking about the maybe gaps in your experience or your services or something, and maybe instead of shying away from those are the things that you kind of fess up to or make more of. And I think I had a similar experience when I started freelancing, and I didn't have much experience, and actually most of my work experience was totally irrelevant and really random. And I thought people are going to look at this and think, who is this guy? What's he been doing with his life? But instead of shying away from that, I kind of condensed it down to a paragraph, and it was at the end of my CV, and I just thought, well, I'll just kind of explain that I, spent all this time doing weird things, and I don't know. I never really found out what people thought of it. A few people commented, but I just thought I'd rather draw attention to it and make a bit of a joke out of it than be embarrassed about it.
And one of the bits we were saying at the end around what are the specific places where the pratfall effect is really powerful. It's where everyone else is doing the opposite. And I picked estate agents as being the extreme example. Actually, I think CVs would be an even better example of everyone else is overglossing it. There's a massive lack of trust in what people say. Therefore, by you admitting the weakness, all your other claims become more believable and therefore stronger. So I think it is definitely worth doing. Especially when you don't need, you can have a massive business with 99% of people hating you. You just need to appeal to a small group. It's a business set up for some people loving you rather than necessarily everyone.
Yes, and actually, there's a great book by Haruki Murakami, and it's, he's a fabulous novelist, but he wrote a book about, I think it's called What I Think About When I'm Running.
Oh, go running.
Something like that. And he talks about when he used to run a bar, like a jazz bar or jazz cafe, and he said something in there which was so profound. I wrote it down because he just said something like, I don't have to make everybody happy. I don't have to please every customer that comes in. I have to please the people that keep coming back, the people that like my jazz bar, and that's it. And it's fine if some people come in and they hate the drinks, they hate the music, it's too loud. It doesn't matter because I know that all my regulars love it. And I thought that was really an interesting way and quite different to what I had been thinking about business as being that, every customer is always right. You have to please everybody and all that those kind of messages. And it's quite liberating to think, no, I just have to please my clients. That's it.
And what I talk about when I talk about running, but
yes, that's it.
Just a quick Google. So I love that, and I think that's being shown in advertising. Think about there've been some great campaigns where have almost defined themselves by what they're not. The 7-Up and Cola campaign or Virgin versus British Airways. I think there's a power in being open about not trying to please everyone. Because people believe in trade-offs. You can't be good at everything. So if you admit a weakness, the people who aren't particularly bothered about that area will find your other strengths that much more believable.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Well, I think so. We've come to the end of the questions. So, Richard, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing some of your insights from your fantastic book. And I really do urge everyone to get a copy. I've got 2 copies for some reason. I got it on my Kindle, and then I felt like I really needed a print copy that I could annotate and turn the corners down and scribble notes and stuff. Because I think it's so interesting and so relevant for copywriters. I mean, we're trying to persuade people to do things, to buy things, to take an interest in something, and understanding these cognitive biases, means that we can understand some of the objections that people might have and think about ways around them. It's not about manipulating people. It's just about understanding the way our minds work. And I think it's well worth a read. So thank you, Richard, for joining us.
Not at all. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. And just a quick note to anyone, if you joined late or missed a bit or want to come back and listen again, the recording of this session will be available from your ProCopywriters dashboard. Thank you again for joining us, to everyone who made it. And we'll be back in a month or 2. And thank you again, Richard.